Imagine, dear friends, a moment when the inner landscape, the hidden and unknown, rises of its own accord into consciousness. In that moment our tightly clenched will loosens, and suddenly miracles appear, not as distant icons, but as intimate eruptions of meaning. My meditation here is upon the paradox. It is only when control is released that the miraculous can take form. Our psyche, not governed by the ego's tightening grip, becomes a field ripe with archetypal emergence. Consider the unconscious as a sacred well. If we lean too close, gripping its edge, in terror our reflection distorts, no image appears. But if we step back, surrender our judgment, allow the surface to rest, the well's depths return our image, and more, the unexpected, the wondrous. This letting go is itself an archetypal journey, a descent, not to be feared, but to be embraced. Like Orpheus entering the underworld, only by moving toward the shadows can one encounter the guiding light. In this descent lies the individuation that we so deeply need, the self that emerges only when ego loosens its hold. Then miracles, unbidden, unrequested, rise. They are not spectacles performed for our comfort, but psyche's spontaneous healing intelligence, revealing symbols that guide us toward wholeness. There is an intelligence in the depths of the psyche that far exceeds the calculating grasp of the conscious mind. This intelligence is not the product of deliberate thought, nor is it the child of reason's slow labor. It is spontaneous, eruptive, and often irrational to the ego's sensibilities. Yet its irrationality is the very sign that it comes from a deeper order. What people call miracles often arise from this secret source, not as violations of nature, but as revelations of a greater pattern which the ego had neither designed nor foreseen. The ego, in its ceaseless striving, imagines itself the master of life. It arranges plans, schemes, and contingencies, convinced that only through its vigilance can existence remain intact. And yet, again and again, events unfold which the ego could never have orchestrated. Its encounters happen by uncanny timing. Answers appear to questions never consciously asked. The right image or symbol emerges in a dream as if summoned by invisible hands. These are not accidents in the crude sense, but the expressions of a living totality within us that seeks to restore balance and meaning. The psyche has its own laws, older and deeper than the laws of conscious will. When the ego releases its compulsive control, these laws have space to operate. The result is often experienced as miraculous, not because the natural order has been suspended, but because we suddenly perceive ourselves within an order far more intricate than the mind's narrow designs. What we call coincidence may be the outer face of an inner necessity. What we name luck may be the mask worn by a guiding hand within. Such moments are rarely gentle to the ego. They come as disruptions to carefully laid plans, as inexplicable shifts in direction, or as sudden insights that overturn long-held beliefs. The deeper psyche does not flatter our self-image, it calls us to transformation, and this often feels like catastrophe before it feels like grace. But the very force that disturbs us is also the force that heals. It works by bringing forth precisely those images, situations, or relationships that our conscious mind would never have chosen, yet which we most need for our own wholeness. The spontaneous wisdom of the psyche cannot be summoned by command. It is not a servant of the will, but a sovereign in its own realm. To encounter it, one must allow a certain receptivity, a relinquishing of the rigid categories by which we try to manage life. This is why the state of letting go is so essential. Control narrows the field of possibility, surrender opens it. In surrender, the unconscious can speak, and its speech is the language of symbol, dream, and synchronicity. In dream life especially, the miraculous is commonplace. Here the psyche creates entire worlds, rich in meaning, beyond anything our conscious fantasy could fabricate. Symbols arrive charged with an energy that feels both personal and universal. They are not invented by us. they are discovered in us, as if they had always been waiting. The same principle operates in waking life when events align with uncanny precision, when an external happening mirrors an inner state so perfectly that the division between inner and outer seems to dissolve. In such moments we feel ourselves participants in a living mystery. This mystery is not an indulgence for idle speculation, it is the very ground upon which transformation depends. The spontaneous wisdom of the psyche seeks always to complete what is partial, to reconcile what is divided, to heal what is wounded. It works ceaselessly toward wholeness, whether or not we are aware of its operations. When we resist, its action is distorted into symptoms, compulsions, or crises. When we allow it, its action becomes guidance, creativity, and renewal. To live in relationship with this inner wisdom is to accept that life will not always conform to our expectations. Indeed, it will often lead us in directions we would never have chosen consciously. Yet it is precisely along these unexpected paths that the richest meaning is found. The miracle, then, is not the fulfillment of our will, but the discovery that our will is part of a greater will, one that works through us, often in spite of us, for the sake of our deeper becoming. What the ego experiences as miracle is, from the perspective of the psyche, simply the natural unfolding of its own truth. We stand in awe not because nature has been suspended, but because we have, for a moment, glimpsed nature in its fullness. The world reveals itself as an intimate mirror of the soul, and the soul as a participant in the world's unfolding drama. In such moments we know not with the mind, but with the whole of our being, that we are held within a pattern vast enough to make sense of our smallness. To trust this is no small task. It requires courage to loosen one's grip, to allow the possibility that meaning can emerge from beyond the control of our conscious will, but the reward is immense. For when the ego steps aside, the spontaneous wisdom of the psyche takes its rightful place, and life becomes not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. And in that mystery, what we call miracles happen every day. Individuation is often misunderstood as a grand project of self-construction, as though one could consciously design the self in the same way a craftsman shapes a statue. Yet the truth is far more paradoxical. The self does not arise from the accumulation of control, but from its relinquishment. It comes into being not when the ego dominates the psyche, but when it surrenders its imagined sovereignty and allows the deeper patterns of life to unfold. The ego, for all its necessity, is a narrow island floating on the vast sea of the unconscious. It clings to its shores, building walls against the unpredictable tides. It fears that to loosen its grip would mean to be swept away into chaos. And yet these very tides contain the materials of our wholeness. By holding too tightly, the ego cuts itself off from the living waters that would renew it. It is through release, not abdication, but a conscious letting go, that the boundaries between ego and self begin to dissolve and a larger identity can emerge. Such release is not passivity. It is an act of trust in the deeper order of the psyche, a willingness to be led by something greater than personal will. It begins when we recognize that much of what we call control is merely resistance, the refusal to engage with what the unconscious is trying to bring forth. This resistance often takes the form of rigid plans, inflexible beliefs, or compulsive habits that give the illusion of stability. Yet beneath them lies a fear of transformation, a fear that if the structures loosen, something unknown will take their place. And indeed, something unknown will, but it is precisely this unknown that holds the key to our individuation. To release control is to step into a space where the unconscious can speak. It may speak in dreams, in sudden insights, in synchronicities that seem to stitch the inner and outer worlds together. At first, these messages may be unsettling. They may contradict the ego's desires, challenge its narratives, or expose its illusions. But they come with a certain inevitability, as though the self has been calling to us all along, waiting for the moment when we would finally listen. The path of individuation demands that we accept the tension between what we consciously intend and what the deeper psyche demands. This tension is not resolved by forcing one side to submit to the other, but by allowing the two to enter into dialogue. Such dialogue can only occur when the ego relinquishes its claim to absolute authority. It must learn to listen without immediately seizing control, to observe without rushing to impose meaning. In that receptive state, new possibilities arise, possibilities that the ego, in its narrow vision, could never have conceived. Release is also a descent. To let go is to allow oneself to sink into the depths where the archetypes dwell, where the roots of the personality entwine with the collective patterns of humanity. This descent is often accompanied by uncertainty, even fear, for the structures that once defined us begin to loosen. But if we resist the impulse to seize control, the descent becomes a journey of discovery. We find that beneath the layers of persona, ambition, and social conditioning lies a center that is not constructed but given, a center that has been quietly guiding our steps all along. The integration of this center into conscious life is the heart of individuation. It is not achieved by the ego's conquest, but by its collaboration with the self. Such collaboration is impossible when the ego clings to its own supremacy. Only in the act of release can the ego become a partner rather than a tyrant. Then the unconscious no longer appears as a threat to be subdued, but as an ally offering the raw material of transformation. In this process, control is replaced by alignment. The ego learns to move with the current rather than against it, to recognize when to act and when to yield. Life ceases to be a battle for dominance and becomes a dance between the known and the unknown, and in that dance the self begins to take form, not as a fixed image, but as a living, evolving reality. The irony is that the more we let go, the more fully we become ourselves. Release does not erase the ego, it refines it, allowing it to serve rather than to rule. The structures we once clung to are replaced by a deeper stability, one that arises from being rooted in the whole of our nature rather than in a fragment of it. This is the true strength of individuation. It is not the power to control life, but the capacity to participate in it fully without fear of its changes. Thus, individuation through release is not the loss of self, but the discovery of the self. It is the art of yielding to the depths without drowning, of opening the hand that once grasped so tightly and finding that it is already filled. In letting go, we do not fall into emptiness, we fall into the embrace of that which has always been seeking to make us whole. There comes a time in life when the call to surrender arrives, not as a polite suggestion, but as an undeniable summons. It does not ask for our opinion or our readiness. It simply appears, often in the form of crisis, loss, or an inner emptiness that no effort can fill. This moment is not merely personal, it is archetypal. It belongs to an ancient pattern, a myth that has been lived and relived by countless souls before us. To surrender is to step into that myth, to take up the role assigned to us in the great drama of transformation. The myths of every culture speak of such a passage. The hero must leave the familiar world, relinquishing comfort and certainty, and venture into the unknown. The descent into the underworld, the crossing of the dark forest, the wandering in the desert, these are symbolic landscapes of surrender. They represent the relinquishing of control, the laying down of the weapons of the ego, so that a deeper power might guide the way. No true initiation is possible without this letting go, for as long as we cling to our own narrow strategies, the greater journey cannot begin. The archetypal journey of surrender is rarely gentle. It often tears away the illusions we have wrapped around ourselves for safety. Relationships may dissolve, ambitions may collapse, and the identities we have carefully cultivated may feel suddenly hollow. The old structures no longer hold, and the ground beneath us seems uncertain. The ego experiences this as failure or catastrophe, but in truth it is the necessary dismantling of the fortress that has kept us from encountering the larger life within. In mythic terms, this stage is the death of the old king, the shattering of the old order, the breaking of the vessel that has contained us. It is the moment when the protagonist is stripped bare, no longer able to rely on familiar strengths. This stripping is not cruelty, it is initiation, for only when the old skin is shed can the new form emerge. To surrender is to accept this death willingly, to trust that beyond the collapse lies a greater wholeness. Yet surrender is not the same as passivity. It is an active engagement with the unknown. It requires the courage to keep walking into the darkness without demanding guarantees. In the myths, the hero does not lie down in the forest and wait for rescue. He or she continues onward, guided only by faint signs, unexpected helpers, and an inner sense of necessity. So it is in our own lives. The journey demands that we remain awake, attentive, and responsive, even as we relinquish the illusion of absolute control. Along the path, figures from the depths may appear, dream images, symbolic encounters, or sudden insights that seem to come from nowhere. These are the guides of the underworld, the emissaries of the deeper psyche. They do not flatter us, they challenge us, confront us, and often speak in riddles. To heed them is part of the surrender, for they lead us along routes the conscious mind would never choose. In following, we learn a new form of navigation, one that listens as much to inner signals as to outer circumstances. The archetypal journey also demands patience. In a world obsessed with speed and outcome, surrender teaches the slow rhythms of transformation. Seeds germinate in darkness, the caterpillar dissolves in the chrysalis before becoming a butterfly, so too must parts of us dissolve before something new can be born. The waiting can feel unbearable, for the ego craves action and certainty. Yet it is in the stillness, in the space where nothing seems to be happening, that the deepest changes take root. Eventually, if the surrender is complete, a shift occurs. The darkness begins to yield to a faint light, not blinding, but enough to show the way. We emerge from the underworld altered, bearing something of the mystery within us. The world may appear the same, but we no longer inhabit it in the same way. We move with a quiet authority, a groundedness that comes from having faced the dissolution of the old self and having trusted the journey enough to let it happen. In this return, the archetypal cycle completes itself. The one who surrendered now carries the treasure back to the ordinary world. That treasure may be wisdom, compassion, a new vision, or simply the deep knowing that one can live without the armor of constant control. The surrender has revealed that life moves through us more profoundly than we could ever manage by will alone. Thus, the journey of surrender is not a detour or a failure. It is the very path by which we are initiated into the fullness of our being. To resist it is to remain imprisoned in the small kingdom of the ego. To accept it is to step into the vast realm of the self. It is a journey written into the oldest stories and into the deepest layers of our own souls, waiting for the moment when we are ready, or perhaps simply when we have no choice to begin. Beneath the surface of our conscious awareness lies a vast, uncharted territory, a depth that is not inert but alive with forces, images, and patterns older than our individual existence. This realm is not a passive storehouse of forgotten memories. It is the creative foundation from which new life continually arises. It is here in the depths that the conditions for what we call the miraculous are formed, not as interruptions of nature, but as the natural flowering of a hidden order. The unconscious is not bound by the same logic that governs the waking mind. It operates through symbols, through the language of dreams, through sudden intuitions and uncanny coincidences. These manifestations may seem irrational, but they possess their own integrity, an order that does not require the permission or approval of the ego. In fact, the more the ego relinquishes its compulsion to dominate, the more freely the unconscious can act, and it is in these moments that the miraculous emerges. We are accustomed to thinking of miracles as rare events, as exceptional disruptions of the usual course of things. Yet the unconscious, in its quiet persistence, generates countless small miracles each day: the healing of a psychic wound we never consciously addressed, the spontaneous arrival of a solution to a problem long abandoned, the meeting with a person at the precise moment their presence can alter our path. These are not accidents in the shallow sense. They are expressions of a deeper synchrony, as though the inner and outer worlds had conspired in silence. For the ego, accustomed to its own strategies, this can be disorienting. It prefers to believe that every meaningful event is the result of its own effort. But when the unconscious is allowed to participate, meaning arrives unbidden, carrying with it a sense of inevitability. What we call miraculous is, from this perspective, the visible crest of a wave whose motion began far below the surface of awareness. The unconscious is a fertile ground, but it is not neutral. It seeks balance, integration, and wholeness. It responds to the imbalances of the conscious personality not by direct command, but by shaping circumstances, generating images, and stirring emotions that draw us toward the missing parts of ourselves. The miracle, then, is not a random gift. It is the psyche's way of bringing into being what is necessary for our growth, often bypassing the plans we have so carefully laid. This process can be unsettling. The unconscious does not concern itself with the ego's comfort or convenience. Its interventions may feel like disruptions, stripping away what we thought was essential. Yet in retrospect, we often see that these apparent losses cleared the way for a deeper fulfillment. The miracle is not always what we want, but it is always in service to what we most need. Dreams offer a clear example of this. In dreams, the unconscious stages events and encounters that can shift the direction of our lives. A single dream image, mysterious, symbolic, charged with emotion, can lodge itself in our awareness and subtly alter our choices for years. Similarly, in waking life, we may encounter patterns of synchronicity, events in the outer world aligning so perfectly with our inner state that the division between the two seems to dissolve. These moments feel miraculous precisely because they reveal that the boundary between psyche and world is far more permeable than we imagine. But the unconscious does not simply hand us these moments, it requires our participation. We must cultivate an openness to its messages, an attentiveness to the subtle ways it communicates. This means not dismissing the improbable, not turning away from the irrational, but engaging with it as though it carries a truth we have yet to understand. It means allowing space for stillness, for reflection, for the images of the inner world to take shape without being forced into premature interpretation. When we approach the unconscious in this way, we find that the miraculous is not a rare interruption, but a natural rhythm. Life begins to reveal itself as an ongoing dialogue between what we know and what we do not know, between the visible and the invisible. In that dialogue, the unexpected becomes not a threat but a source of renewal. We learn to trust that even in apparent disorder there is a deeper order unfolding. The true miracle is not the occurrence of the improbable, but the recognition that the improbable has always been at work in the very fabric of our being. The unconscious is its soil, its hidden workshop, its inexhaustible spring. When we allow ourselves to live in relation to this depth, we cease to demand that life conform to our narrow plans and begin to participate in a larger pattern. It is there, in that participation, that the miraculous ceases to be an exception and becomes a way of life. So I invite you, unclench your grip, step back from the edge of control, and breathe. In that space you become the witness to miracles, not distant or theatrical, but personal, pervasive, piercing through the veils of your conscious certainty. It is in such surrender that the numinous breathes life into your very being.